thank you so much for coming today. Really excited to have you.
Of course, I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, it's great. I think it's a really good way to hopefully engage everyone in a time where I feel like I'm not seeing it as often as I would like, so it's great.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, cool. We have some people here. That's great. Do you think you could just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and like what you're doing and how your work in like education advocacy has gone so far?
Yeah, so my name is Deborah Olatunji. I'm a 17-year-old education activist, author, and leader from Newcastle, Delaware. I have been working in the education advocacy space for the past 3 years now, and I guess my journey really started off when I went to this almost like an open session for how to ideate a dual school program. So it was kind of like school, but fun, because students got to interact with experiential learning and really designing their own pathways for discovery and innovation. And so those were my real first steps in understanding how to create an education system that is so much more engaging. And then I ended up, as you know, writing my own book about these different perspectives in education and how to create a high school system that is not only engaging and interesting, but something that is beneficial in helping students discover their identity and their purpose.
Yeah, and like, what have you like learned so far? And like, I know you're talking about redesigning the high school experience. Like, what would you see as the biggest change if you were to do that?
I think the most prominent change is definitely in the curriculum, because that's often where most of the complaints are. Students aren't engaged with it. They're often bored in class because the content just isn't interesting. And so I think the most important push would be making content that is in context to students' experiences by allowing them to study their interests, to go deeper in subjects as opposed to only doing things that the state requires, and then just letting them have fun with material as opposed to just using it to test them and assess their scores.
Yeah, and what has this advocacy looked like for you so far? What have you done in the past year?
So for the most part, I've taken my advocacy to the legislative side. I've been working with a couple of state senators on reforming a lot of the bills that we have in Delaware. There's currently a petition going on to change the curriculum, which is pretty active. So I'm really encouraged by that as well, because people are realizing now more than ever that the stories that we read about in classes, or the different people that are of real importance in our classroom discussions, aren't people who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And we really want to change that, because when you don't see yourself in education, it's hard to feel the same success as others who have seen themselves for such a long time.
Yeah, for sure. And what has been, like, I guess, the epicenter of your work? Like, for example, I know this is something that's a worldwide issue, but do you see this as something you're doing locally? How do you think it could maybe go larger than that, nationally even?
I think that it's definitely on a national scale, and education systems are not the same in terms of the curriculum in different states, but on a national level, I feel like there's been such big pushback from the top, because, you know, Secretary Betsy DeVos isn't really doing her job. She's not supporting students, and she's constantly putting the needs of other groups ahead of actual students, which is honestly appalling. And then there's also an international point of it, because a lot of students from all across the globe have reached out to me, and they're just like, I agree with the same frustrations that you may be going through with the American education system. Of course, there are some differences, but the sentiment still remains the same, that the education system needs to change because it's not engaging 21st century learners anymore, and it's way outdated. And the other thing is the expectations. I think our world expects so much of our age group without requiring us to have the time and space to really understand what our resources are and what our interests are, and that creates a really big disconnect when we graduate from high school and we're suddenly like, you know, what do I want to do? I've never had the time to actually explore, and that perspective is also looked down on, because they're like, well, you've had 17 years of life, why don't you know what to do? Well, you never given me the opportunity to figure it out. So it's definitely an issue on the state, national, and international level, because students all over are telling me, you know, I wish that I had an education system that looks like the one that you described in your book.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Like, the first thing I think about when you say that is just like college applications and how that works. So what are your thoughts on that process and how that may affect, I guess, the way we choose what to do, what activities we choose to join?
Yeah, so I think it's important to preface why we talk about college so much, and I think it's because we have the push from everywhere, from our parents, our teachers, our administrators, that you have to go to college. And I think that's another perspective that needs to be reshaped, because what we're realizing is there's so many students who are going into debt, and they're going into school not really knowing what they're doing, and that behavior is encouraged when that could be so much more detrimental. And instead they could take a gap year maybe, or just take a few months off to really discover what they want to go into, as opposed to taking on all that debt at such a young age. You know, we're only 17, 18, 19 years years old, we don't really know exactly what we want yet, but we're pushing everyone to go to college, which is very, very detrimental. That being said, though, the college application process, as you know, is incredibly corrupt. There are so many factors that go into it, from SAT and ACT scores, and thankfully for your class, it's not required, it's optional, but there's an up and down to that, even it being optional and you not having to submit it. And then the extracurriculars, that's definitely based on your social economic class. You may have access to extreme programs like maybe a scientific research project over the summer, or even going abroad to study. So there's so many different things that go into this process, and I think that colleges are having a more and more difficult time discovering what it really means when a student is passionate and discovering their fit. And when we're told all our lives, well, you have to be well-rounded, you have to do academics, you have to have the best grades in the world, you have to be top of your class, students don't really get to focus and hone in on what they're truly interested in because of that outside message that if you're not well-rounded, then colleges aren't going to like you. And that should never be your goal, you know? It shouldn't be that your goal to impress the colleges or please them. It should solely be your goal to be looking out for how you can learn, how you can enrich yourself, and then how you can give back to a community that has helped you grow and develop.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that's such an important message right now, especially during this time when, like, things are becoming optional, or people are just encountering so many situations where the path they thought they were going to take may be rattled or shattered a little bit. So yeah, that's great. Do you think you could talk to us a little bit about your book? I'm really interested in, like, what you wrote, how you got the idea for it, the process you took.
Yeah, so I love that question because there's so many different ways to approach it. There were 18 chapters in the book, and I started writing this in the winter of my junior year. So maybe the busiest year of my high school experience. I went on this journey to write this book. And a lot of the perspectives that I talk about are really important because some people may think that this is just a book for high school students or just a book for college students. But I've had people from all across the spectrum, from really younger kids, from 12 years old to 30 years old, saying, like, there was something in this book for me. And so I think the most important message is that the different perspectives that I talk about, from senators to teachers to entrepreneurs to college students to parents and even teachers, all those perspectives are in there because regardless of where you are in life, the education system and how it continues to progress and innovate is important for you. And the other really big important thing for me was that I always was thinking about my future children whenever I was writing this book, because it was a really big point of motivation in realizing that 10 years down the line or 15 years down the line, whenever I have kids, I don't want them to be complaining about the same issues that I had when I was in education, because I know that I have the power to change it. And so that's always what I use to encourage other education activists that I reach out to or reach out to me, because the whole message and goal of the book is to create action steps for other people. There's tons of calls of action in there, as well as key takeaways and points that you can get from reading the chapters. But the whole point is to mobilize you as somebody who wants to be a catalyst, not just in your own education experience, but in the education experiences of those around you and those people who are to come.
Yeah, and you're talking about being like a catalyst. Was there a specific moment in time when you knew, like, this is what I want to do, or, like, this is what I want to push for reform in?
I think my biggest point of motivation was in the 10th grade. This is actually the story that I write about in my college essay, so I've spoken about this quite some time. But I failed a biology pop quiz. I got 63, I'm pretty sure. And it wasn't just that grade that was a turning point, but having a conversation with my classmates who also didn't do well in the pop quiz, and we were having pop quizzes every other day, so there wasn't any real learning going on in biology, and so we were all just at the brink of frustration, and I just asked myself, the question, and I continue to ask myself that question in everything that I do. I said, what does education mean to me, and what does it not look like at the same time? And when I was sitting in that question and really thinking through it, I realized that none of the experiences that I had up to the point in my sophomore year really reflected what I wanted my education system process to look like. And so that was when I knew there really had to be a real change, not just for myself, but for helping other people around me, because we were all classmates. We fed off of each other's energy, and you could tell when somebody had low energy because they weren't engaged, or the material just wasn't it for them. And that was when I really knew that this has to change, because if we're talking about, creating an environment where people feel safe to share their opinions, or a community where you can share your different beliefs and ideas, we have to cultivate that. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. And so that was really, really important for me in determining how do we cultivate that in the classroom, and then how do we make it so much more beneficial, not just for the teachers, but for the students as well.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I'm thinking, so as you did that, and have there been any changes that you've seen implemented in local schools or even, like, nationally that you think show that, even though you can talk about this all day, like, that when you put this in, like, it really does work?
So there haven't been any legislative changes, but a lot of people who have read the book, for example, I have a friend who goes to a school in, I think, the Christiana School District. She told me, and one of the things that I tell students to do is suggest things to their teachers, because sometimes you may think that whatever a teacher has in the curriculum is set into stone. But she told me that she was asking her teacher, can we study this instead? Or maybe can we take this approach to the book that we're reading? And the teacher was very flexible about it. She was just like, yeah, I actually really love that idea. I'm glad that you brought it up to me, and we're definitely going to pursue that. And so I think there's also an importance of encouraging people to speak out about these issues and problems, because, like I always say, teachers won't know there's a problem unless you say it to them. And if they don't want to solve it, that's an entirely different issue. But for the most part, when you bring up these issues with your teachers, you'll be surprised how flexible they are and understanding and wanting to create an education experience that fits your interests.
Yeah, and that's great. There's such a large stigma, I think, right now around the fact that, like, teachers aren't here to help you, or that they're just someone that you're so distant from. I think that's great, being able to go up to a teacher and to work together to kind of create that goal. That's really good. And are there any types of legislative changes that you'd like to see happen in the future?
I'd love to see a reform of our civics education program as well as the economics in our classes, because I was applying for this one program called the USSYP, United States Senate Youth Program, and in the interview they were talking about how in Delaware specifically there is a requirement for civics, but the civics that I took when I was a ninth grader, I don't even remember, and none of it focused on advocacy, none of it focused on real world change or even the importance of voting. And so I said to myself, this is the civics education program that you're advocating for, and this is the education system that you're proud of. You shouldn't be, because we're not even talking about how to be an activist, how to create real movement in your community, and that's something that's so incredibly vital, not just for this time, but for students who are really frustrated with their experiences and don't know who to talk to. It's important to know that they can create a bill and ask their state senator to co-sponsor it, or they can reach out to their representative and tell them about these issues, but we're not being encouraged to do that. And so one of the biggest changes fundamentally that I'd love to see for Delaware is just completely rebuilding the civics education program, because it's not working. It's not working at all.
Yeah, what would you like to see that program look like in the future?
I think it would be really important to start bringing in more outside voices, and that's something I bring up a lot. It very much feels like we're in a silo whenever we're just in the classroom and not talking to people who are outside of our textbooks or even outside of our grade levels. And so there's so many people who can be community resources to come in and have these conversations with us, and I think that they would be so much more beneficial to put those words into action and creating spaces where people can talk about different places that they want to make changes, because ultimately I have my own opinions about how civics could change. Like, I definitely feel like we should be teaching about advocacy. We should talk about the importance of voting. We should talk about redlining and all the social economic differences that we all have. But there's another student who may want to have a lot more to that. So it's not just my opinion that I'm realizing, it's all of our opinions, and making sure that the pieces of the education system that we want to have are all included. And by having a community conversation, we can get to the root of what the new curriculum should look like.
Yeah, for sure. And there are a lot of students that joined us today. What is something you think that could be a first step that people could take? I know you talked about talking to teachers and stuff, but in the event that doesn't work, or that doesn't bring the type of change you want to see, what are some steps that we could take every day to kind of help improve on this issue?
I think one of the biggest steps that you can take is being self-aware and doing your own self-assessment in terms of, what issues are you seeing in the education system? What does education mean to you, like I said? And then what resources do you have that can help you supplement the education experience that your school isn't giving you? A lot of the experiences, though a lot of the wonderful experiences that I ended up having were outside of the classroom, and because I stepped out of myself and my comfort zone and my silo like I was talking about, and I realized that if I wasn't going to get the education system that I wanted for my school, I had to create it for myself. And so there's a real push behind action and mobilization right now with the current traditional, one-size-fits-all education system that we have in the moment. But if we all work together to be the catalyst, to be education activists, and to really talk about legislative action, then students won't have to do as much supplementing, and they'll be able to do a lot more innovating and collaborating in the new space and new education system that we design.
Yeah, that's really great. So when you did this, are there resources that you started? I know you talked a little bit to me before about some initiatives you've taken with this, or some rallies that you've put together. Can you talk a little about your experience in not only creating them, but the effect they had on the community?
Yeah, so an organization that I started, I talked about this a little bit in the takeover yesterday, but the Student Leadership Initiative program, I started that when I was a junior in high school, and I think that was also a really big motivation point for me in terms of writing the book, because 5 months into the program, I realized the kids were getting a lot of real value from it. They were saying that it helped them transition into high school better, and they had a real circle of community that they could rely on. And I thought to myself, how can I get this message out on a national scale? It's not like I can, just snap my fingers and there's 500 slip organizations all over the world, but I can write this book. I can create this material for people, not just in slip organizations, but in different already existing youth programs, to use this book to empower their students. And so with SLIP, we focus mainly on peer mentorship, professionalism, community building, and then a lot of focus on experiential learning, because we try to create the distance and the distinction between project-based learning and experiential learning, because they're not the same. And I think when students realize that they can step into the experiences, for example, if they want to go into computer science, they can do a coding program, or they can do a coding competition. They're getting so much more hands-on work than they ever would in a traditional class. Or if they want to do a writing project, oftentimes in our English classes, we're not encouraged to be storytellers. We're just supposed to be academic scholars. And so if they do these essay contests, if they do these different writing experiences or writing courses outside of their education experience, it really can help mobilize the way that they are learning, and also the way they make a connection between their interests and what they want to pursue in the future.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about, I've seen you've held, not rallies, but you've just gathered like the speeches you've given and the really moving stories you've told. What was your experience in delivering those?
Yeah, so I've done quite a few speaking events, from rallies on menstrual advocacy to poetry competitions on Black culture and racial justice, and then, of course, keynotes for the book about education, mobilization, and really transforming the education system. And so I'll talk first about the rally, because it was a very eye-opening moment for me. My friend helped organize Delaware's National Period Day on October 19, 2019, and I was really inspired to write a poem titled "To Be Woman is to Be Human," and I really just talk about the importance of the fact that we don't have these essential items in our schools. For example, we don't have tampons, we don't have pads, we don't have them readily accessible in our bathrooms. And then if you go to the wellness center just downstairs, they're always talking about how they have free condoms. And I'm like, why are you offering free condoms when, that's a choice? Obviously, you decide if you're going to do that, but it's not a choice to have a period. You have to have these resources for yourself. And it also, creates confidence in yourself when you're in your education journey, if you're going through your day, and you don't have to worry about, whether or not you're going to have an incident or something like that. And it doesn't happen as often as I think in Delaware, but it happens a lot in other states and in other countries. And so we're really talking about not just how to encourage and empower girls, but giving them the physical resources in the bathrooms to have those products. And that was something that was brought up to me by my friend. And so by participating in that National Period Day, I realized how important it is not just to talk about the issues that I'm really passionate about, but also in mobilizing and helping provide platforms for my friends who also have other issues that they are so incredibly invested in. And it just really made my heart really happy to see her in that position of creating real change for people to come out and support, and then having conversations that may be really uncomfortable for people who don't have a period, to really understand that these are issues that are important and these are issues that we need to be talking about. That seems to be a real common thread in a lot of the advocacy programs that I participate in. For example, I think specifically during this time, people are realizing how infrequently that we talk about race. And that's something that I talk about all the time. Ever since I was creating poems in the 8th grade, I've always talked about race. I'm a Black woman in America. It's something that is a factor of my everyday life. And so a lot of people are coming up to me and they're having these uncomfortable conversations with their family members and their friends. And they're realizing now more than ever how important it is to talk about your position on these things, to change your opinion when you have new information. And then also not just to empathize with people who have been racially discriminated against, but to take real action to dismantling the systems of oppression that are ingrained in our country's fabric. And so that's often a conversation that I have with the different pieces that I wrote. For example, I wrote "I Am" that I shared on the story the other day, and I listened to it again with my mom. And I think it was really disheartening to realize, I wrote this piece 2 years ago, but it feels like it very much, I could just change the last clause of "I am 2018" to "I am 2020," because the same things are going around where people are talking about the contentious matter where Colin Kaepernick took a knee, and now they're talking about the other kind of taking a knee, and people aren't seeing an offense with that, and that's a real problem. And so we're constantly having a lot of circular structure in terms of the advocacy and the mobilization, in that when you don't take real action, these issues are going to continue to present themselves, which is why it's so important to not just have these conversations, but to ask yourself, what are the action steps that I'm going to take to combating racism in my community? What are the action steps that I'm going to take towards making sure that everybody has their own source of education, mobilization, and then what are the ways that I'm going to help create resources for girls and young women and people who menstruate to have the products that they need in their communities, so that there isn't insecurity about that anymore, and to make sure that we can have these conversations without not, considering the real action that has to come in.
Yeah, I think you're a really great example of someone that has the passion and has been able to convert that into becoming an advocate. And I know there are so many people that have similar passions and are really, really want to make change in something but don't know how to start. So how do you see that bridge between I have a passion and I'm an advocate for that issue?
I think the difference between having a passion and being an advocate is in your action. And so I talk about this a lot in the book also, where you can have the idea of wanting to do something and it's just an idea that you think about all the time, but you don't actually put real action into it. Or you can actually verbalize that idea so it becomes real for yourself. You can write it down and whatnot, and then you take the action steps. I think that's the difference between being in your head about an idea or being in your head about a passion and actually doing the work to progress the movement and the progress in it, and then also getting other people around you to help move and influence that work. I think being an activist also means you're actively asking questions of other people and also including other voices in the conversation to make sure that you're not just going in this individual pursuit, because I'm never saying that I'm the only education activist in the world or the only racial justice advocate in the world, because that's not true. And so when you realize that a passion is it's not just a thought, but it's something that you can ruminate on for days and days and days, but until you put real action behind it, it's not any real direction. That's when you can start to take the steps. I really like this subject. I'm really interested in advocating for this. What can I do to make it better? How can I make the system how can I improve the system that is currently existing? Or how can I help to rebuild one that actually works for everyone?
Yeah, that's great. We have a few minutes left, so I want to see if anyone had any questions. I think that's just amazing. I'm in awe every day talking to you of the things you've done and what you've done. So thank you so much, I think, for everything you're doing. It's truly making an impact. But if anyone has questions, Deborah is a great person to ask. Oh my gosh, we have a few. Okay. So one of them from Melena was, have you seen a huge... Oh, this is actually from yesterday, but do you want to answer a few of these, I think, for people here? What would you tell your younger self? This is something you answered on the live yesterday, but I think you had a really great answer that I like to hear.
So on the live on the takeover yesterday, I'm pretty sure I said I would tell myself to be a lot more flexible, and I think I would also add just 2 more points for my younger self, younger Deborah. Not just being flexible, but also making sure that you're taking the time to do that self-assessment, like I was talking about, to evaluate, what is important to you, what issues matter, and then what kind of action steps you can take towards really making change around it. And then this is something that I have actually. I'll take it off the wall. I have this as a reminder. It's a note to self that says, don't measure your progress using someone else's ruler. And I don't know if you know this, but I'm an identical twin. So I've always been compared every single day of my life, if not every single second. And so it's a reminder that I give myself every single day that it's not adding to your passion or adding to the work that you're doing when you take the moments to compare yourself. And so, it's not like I don't. Of course, I'm human. There are moments when I do, but having that reminder on there just to realize that, someone may be measuring their progress in inches. Someone may be measuring their progress in meters or feet. And, it doesn't mean that your progress or your contribution to something isn't meaningful. It just means that you're taking an entirely different path, and that's okay. And that doesn't mean that you have to go out and create 1 billion podcasts or write 50 screenplays or create 1,000 books. That doesn't mean that. It just means that as long as you are focusing on the heart of what you're interested in and then taking action steps, even if they're small, just take those small, consistent actions towards really making change, then you're fine. You're good. You're in this for the long run. And so you always have to think about your life, not in a sprint, but in a marathon, because it takes off the pressure that you have from society, maybe your parents, and even yourself to constantly be running this life race at 60 miles per hour. You don't have to do that, And so I would just encourage my younger self to take life one day at a time, to be more present in the moment. And then also, don't be afraid to ask for help. I think a lot of these issues that we talked about today, they really deal with leaning on people in your community. And so when you can evaluate your sources of support who are around you, it's a lot easier, and it gets more comfortable to ask people their opinions and to ask them, this is an area where I'm struggling. How can you help me, or how can you lead me to someone who can? And then it helps you in terms of the different organizations that you want to start, or organizations that you want to join that are currently existing, to answer the question of how can I take action in this passion that I really care about, and how can I get people around me to pour into that interest as well.
Yeah, for sure. And before we go for today, do you want to preview your TED Talk a little bit? Deborah's a speaker who's going to talk at our conference in April next year. So do you want to just kind of give everyone a little sneak peek as to what you'll be talking about then?
Yes. Do you want me to read the exact words or just give a summary?
Anything you want, whatever you think's best.
All right. I can pull up my TED Talk. But the title of it is How Collective Empowerment Can Ignite the World. And I don't want to spoil the beginning of it because it's I think it's such a magical picture, but there's a lot of imagery in the TED Talk. And so hopefully it'll come out when we have our session, whenever it gets postponed, because I think back to the slides that I created and the conversations that I had with you in February and January, really working on this TED Talk, and then, COVID-19. But I think that the time that we have now to talk about these ideas further will just make the TED Talk even more exciting. And so I'm definitely excited for it.
I am as well. Thank you so much for coming today, Deborah. This was really amazing. We have one question before you go. So Deepthi asked, how do you feel about the changes made in the college application process?
Okay, so I had this discussion with an advisor that I personally used during my college admission process, and I didn't see it from her perspective until she explained this to me, but I think that it's good. It's definitely beneficial that they're making the SAT, ACT, and all the other tests, the gazillion tests that you have to submit, optional. But I think that the kids who already had those test scores from their junior year and already had the scores that they want will have some sort of an upper hand. And that doesn't mean that your test scores are the only thing that defines whether or not you're going to get into a top 20 school, but that is something to think about. If you're not going to send your test scores, then they're going to think that there's a reason for it. And so it's tricky, especially for them. It's not going to be just a walk in the park in terms of acceptances and people on the wait list. And so this you guys' application session is going to be really, really interesting because it's optional. And I'm hoping that the outcome is that they realize that these test scores aren't as evaluative as they think they are, and that there's a lot more of a benefit towards not using the test scores and continuing that for the class of 2022, 2023, and so forth. But I guess we'll really just have to see what they decide on. But that being said, the tests being optional are not the only thing. You should definitely use the summer to focus on creating your college essay, that personal statement. It's going to take a lot of drafts, and I can definitely tell you that it will serve you well if you at least have something down on paper, a general idea of what you want to write about, and then narrow down the colleges that you want to apply to. If those are the only two things that you do this summer, I will be very, very happy and pleased with you, because I've had friends who, even on October 1st, who were like, all right, it's time for college. Which ones am I going to apply to? And I hadn't taken the time to do any real research. And so make sure that you spend this time taking the research in terms of what you're interested in. You don't have to choose a major right now. Of course, you have the time. But, discover which kinds of colleges that you're interested in, and then really work on developing that personal statement.
Yeah, and building off of that a little bit, what do you think it means for students to be truly prepared for success after high school?
I think a student that is truly prepared is somebody who is confident in what they want to pursue, but also understanding that idea may change. And so being flexible to the idea that you have spent all this time in high school, maybe 4 years, pursuing this interest, but you may change your mind, and so I think that having that kind of mental awareness that you're not a monolith, you have different opinions, your mind changes almost every second. And so I think that if people embrace that, as opposed to being scared of changing your major, because there's a statistics that says like 80% of people change their major, be focused more on the impact that you want to make and the interest that you have, as opposed to the singular things that the colleges are looking for, because you'll find so much more benefit and so much more enrichment from graduating from high school if you can look back and say, this is what I decided to take a path in. This is what I decided to make an impact in, and this is how I'm going to continue that impact in the future. You know, all the things that you did in high school, whether you started an organization or you joined one, those things don't have to end. You know, you can continue to add work and add impact to those spaces. And so I think someone who's truly successful is someone who has that self-awareness that they can change, and then also wants to continue to make a long-term impact in the different issues and areas that they have decided to invest themselves in.
Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, last question, I'll let you go. How do we ensure those without privilege have equal access to quality education and opportunity?
Right. So I think the biggest thing is identifying the areas where you need help, and that would definitely help if you're not as privileged as other kids who may have like SAT tutors or, you know, tutors who can read their essays on demand, and then actively outsourcing, trying to find the resources to do so. And so it's not going to be easy. It's definitely not something that's done in a day, but I can definitely direct you to a lot of the resources that I ended up using. And then also the upperclassmen that are in your school. Those are definitely people that you should be talking to, because while I had siblings who went through the college process, it was people who were in the class of 2019 who graduated before me who I reached out to, not that my siblings who were 2 years removed or 4 years removed. And so you kind of have to assess the resources that you have around you. I'm not saying that you're not going to have the same advantages as other people, but don't see it like that. You know, see it as something where you can try to find the resources, and if you can't, again, ask for help, because if you ask someone for help, they may be able to direct you to those resources that you weren't able to find, and ultimately, you know, that one resource can be the defining point of your impact and discovery in the college process.
Yeah, that's really great. All right, I'm gonna let you go, but thank you so much. I think this was great. It's a conversation we definitely need to be having more, and we definitely need to be having more people our age, not just people above us who are always making these roles. So I really, really appreciate you coming today.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. All right. See you. Bye.
Bye.